Hey guys, so I wanted to make a video response to this film called The Great Global Warming Swindle. It was made by Martin Durkin, who is well known for making controversial films, and I selected a few of the film's main points, and I will do my best to explain why they're misleading and why some of them are false. So let's get started.
We are told that the Earth's climate is changing. But the Earth's climate is always changing. In Earth's long history, there have been countless periods when it was much warmer and much cooler than it is today, when much of the world was covered by tropical forests or else vast ice sheets. The climate has always changed, and changed without any help from us humans.
Now, the Earth is about 4.5 billion years old, and we know this from different methods of radiometric dating like rubidium to strontium, potassium to argon, and uranium to lead. And we know a lot about the history of Earth's climate from studying things like rocks, ice, trees, corals, and fossils. And it's true that the Earth's climate has changed many times in the past, but the fact that the climate is changing is not necessarily the concern. It's the rate that it's changing that's alarming. And most of the Earth's past climate change has been relatively gradual, giving species who are adapted to their environments a chance to slowly adapt and survive. If the climate changes rapidly and disrupts those ecosystems, life doesn't have that ability to adapt fast enough. So, for example, the Permian mass extinction that occurred roughly 250 million years ago wiped out 96% of the marine species and 70% of the terrestrial vertebrates. And the main cause of this extinction was a million-year-long eruption event from the Siberian traps. Today, those flood basalts cover an area roughly the size of Western Europe, and the original area is estimated to be 2 to 3 times larger than that. So this is vast amounts of carbon dioxide being pumped into the atmosphere, disrupting the natural balance and rapidly changing the climate.
In the current alarm about global warming, the culprit is industrial society. Thanks to modern industry, luxuries once enjoyed exclusively by the rich are now available in abundance to ordinary people. Novel technologies have made life easier and richer. Modern transport and communications have made the world seem less foreign and distant. Industrial progress has changed our lives. But has it also changed the climate? According to the theory of man-made global warming, industrial growth should cause the temperature to rise. But does it?
Anyone who goes around and says that carbon dioxide is responsible for most of the warming of the 20th century hasn't looked at the basic numbers.
Since the mid-19th century, the Earth's temperature has risen by just over half a degree Celsius. But this warming began long before cars and planes were even invented. What's more, most of the rise in temperature occurred before 1940, during a period when industrial production was relatively insignificant. After the Second World War, during the post-war economic boom, temperatures, in theory, should have shot up. But they didn't. They fell. Not for 1 or 2 years, but for 4 decades. In fact, paradoxically, it wasn't until the world economic recession in the 1970s that they stopped falling.
Temperature went up significantly up to 1940 when human production of CO2 was relatively low. And then in the post-war years, when industry and the whole economies of the world really got going and human production of CO2 just soared, the global temperature was going down. In other words, the facts didn't fit the theory.
So the reason we don't see immediate temperature rise during the Great Economic Boom is because of what is called climate lag, or CO2 lag, which is around 30 to 40 years. And it just has to do with how the physics of greenhouse gases work. So the warming we've seen in the last decade is from emissions in the 1960s, and the emissions we've put into the atmosphere in the last decade, we won't see those effects until the 2040s. So it's analogous to putting a pot of room temperature water on a hot burner And although the burner is much hotter than the water, it takes some time for that water to reach a boil, and it's called thermal inertia. So we wouldn't expect to see immediate warming during the economic boom, just like we wouldn't expect to see the water in the pot immediately start to boil. Instead, we would expect to see those emission effects around the 1980s.
CO2 forms only a very small part of the Earth's atmosphere. In fact, we measure changes in the level of atmospheric CO2 in tens of parts per million.
If you take CO2 as a percentage of all the gases in the atmosphere, the oxygen, the nitrogen, and argon, and so on, it's 0.054%. It's an incredibly small portion. And then, of course, you've got to take that portion that supposedly humans are adding, which is the focus of all the concern, and it gets even smaller.
Although CO2 is a greenhouse gases themselves only form a small part of the atmosphere. What's more, CO2 is a relatively minor greenhouse gas.
So I've heard this argument a few times, and I'll just say quickly that the amount of something isn't directly proportional to how important it is. So to say that just because there's a small percentage doesn't mean it has an insignificant effect.
The greenhouse effect works like this. The sun sends its heat down to Earth. If it weren't for greenhouse gases, this solar radiation would bounce back into space, leaving the planet cold and uninhabitable. Greenhouse gas traps the escaping heat in the Earth's troposphere, a few miles above the surface. And it's here, according to the climate models, that the rate of warming should be highest, if it's greenhouse gas that's causing it. A scientist largely responsible for measuring the temperature in the Earth's atmosphere is Professor John Christie. In 1991, he was awarded NASA's Medal for Exceptional Scientific Achievement, and in 1996 received a special award from the American Meteorological Society for fundamentally advancing our ability to monitor climate. He was a lead author on the UN's Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or IPCC. There are two ways to take the temperature in the Earth's atmosphere: satellites and weather balloons.
What we found consistently is that in a great part of the planet, that the bulk of the atmosphere is not warming as much as we see at the surface in this region. And that's a real head scratcher for us, because the theory is pretty straightforward. And the theory says that if the surface warms, the upper atmosphere should warm rapidly. The rise in temperature of that part of the atmosphere is not very dramatic at all, and really does not match the theory that climate models are expressing at this point.
So John Christie began publishing papers in the 1990s claiming that there were discrepancies in the climate models and that the troposphere was hardly warming. And that contradicted all the other available data at the time. So a number of years later, people began looking into his work and found out that errors had actually been made in his methods for data adjustments. And after the corrections were made, the data showed that the troposphere is in fact warming consistently with the models. But this information actually came out after the film was released.
Volcanoes produce more CO2 each year than all the factories and cars and planes and other sources of man-made carbon dioxide put together.
Okay, so this is just completely dishonest. Volcanoes produce anywhere between 60 to 300 million tons of CO2 per year, while humans produce nearly 35 billion. And you can find these numbers on the U.S. Geological Survey. So, while watching this film, it becomes apparent that Martin Durkin and the others who made it don't care about the actual science and are clearly trying to mislead its viewers. Alright, well, I'm going to end this video with a couple of videos of Martin Durkin being interviewed about the film.
Let's continue, because your film answers the question, or tries to answer the question, why is it getting hotter, with the theory that it's in fact the sun that causes global warming.
In 1991, senior scientists at the Danish Meteorological Institute decided to compile a record of sunspots in the 20th century and compare it with the temperature record. What they found was an incredibly close correlation between what the sun was doing and changes in temperature on Earth. Solar activity, they found, rose sharply to 1940, fell back for almost 4 decades, and then started to rise again.
Well, once again, we asked our climatologists to have a look at this section of the film and to comment on it.
They stop the record because they don't mention it falls when the temperature continues, so it's classic. Pick the section of the record that fits your preconception and then leave out the inconvenient parts.
The graph conveniently stops at 1980 when the temperature starts to rise much more rapidly and the solar activity decreases, the opposite of what they claim.
The story of the graphs gets even more interesting in a way, because in the original version of the swindle you had another of the Danish graphs which they say contained false data. Tell us about that.
Yeah. Well, we had they've got a graph that has 400 years of temperature change and 400 years of solar activity, and there was a gap on a very small gap at one section in I think it's either solar activity or temperature, one or the other, and our graphics guy very helpfully joined it up, which was very embarrassing, and we've now corrected it for subsequent versions.
How many versions of the swindle have you actually put out since the complaints started to come through?
Oh, I mean, I'd have to ask Channel 4 that. I don't know. I mean, we've got an international version.
I've counted at least 4 which have slight or major differences in them.
Oh, no, we immediately made the changes that we could straight away before we could get other graphs done. And then for subsequent ones, we've had graphs redone and to correct the errors that were pointed out.